Okay, let's dive in. Today, we're turning our attention to a single, really powerful chapter of ancient scripture, Hosea chapter 6.
Hmm.
And our source for this deep dive isn't, the chapter itself in isolation, but actually a fascinating study of it. We found it on the Olive Grove podcast website.
Right.
So think of this as exploring insights from a specific interpretation, a particular lens on this biblical text.
That's a good way to put it. Yeah, this study offers a really defined perspective on Hosea 6.
Okay.
Its core focus is understanding that whole dynamic between God and his people, specifically acknowledging their brokenness, but crucially highlighting his unwavering promise, the promise of healing and restoration.
And that's basically our mission for this deep dive. We're going to try and unpack the key lessons, the specific prophetic interpretations, the source highlights, and the practical relevance they draw out. We want to give you a clear picture of what this particular study sees as the text's central meaning and sort of its implications.
Yeah.
It's about understanding this chapter through their eyes, through this analysis.
Exactly. It's not just, reading the chapter casually. It's engaging with one specific detailed exploration of its message. And the study really zeroes in right away on that initial call in verse 1.
It starts right there, doesn't it?
Uh-huh.
Come, let us return to Adonai, for he has torn, and he will heal us. He has struck, and he will bind our wounds. So what does the study highlight about that opening?
Well, it really emphasizes the raw honesty there. It doesn't gloss over the reality of the brokenness, the pain, that state of being torn and struck.
Right.
The study points out that the chapter right before it, Hosea 5, laid out the reasons for this mess. Israel's persistent disobedience, basically.
Okay.
But the power, according to this source, is that the call to return is immediately coupled with that certain divine promise. He will heal, he will bind the wounds. It's immediate.
So it's like acknowledging the consequence, yes, but instantly shifting the focus to God's power and his promise to fix what's broken.
Precisely.
And the study presents this promise as, universal, not just for ancient Israel.
Exactly that. It frames this call to return and the promise of healing that comes with it as being just as available, just as relevant for anyone listening right now. It's a foundational principle the source really pulls from this opening verse.
All right, so that sets the scene. Brokenness, a call to come back, and God's promise to heal. But then the study highlights something quite specific and honestly pretty striking in verses 2 and 3.
Ah, yes. This is where this interpretation gets particularly interesting. Verses 2 and 3 read, "After 2 days he will revive us. On the third day he will raise us up, and we will live in his presence. Let us strive to know Adonai, that he will come is as certain as morning. He will come to us like the rain, like the spring rains that water the earth." And the source material, it spends significant time unpacking these two verses.
And its interpretation here is, it's quite direct, isn't it?
It is, yeah. The study basically argues that even though this was written centuries before Jesus, these words hold a clear prophetic resonance. It sees that sequence described in verse 2. After 2 days, he will revive us. On the third day, he will raise us up, as a direct foreshadowing of the death and, crucially, the resurrection of Jesus Christ.
Okay, wow. That's a strong link to make. How does the study get there? Or what supports that view for them?
Well, it connects it partly to biblical numerology. The study suggests this is a consistent pattern in Scripture. It points out that the number 3 especially often pops up in connection with God's will or action being manifested, being shown here on earth.
Okay.
So seeing on the third day, he will raise us up right here in the context of healing and living in God's presence. Well, the source presents that as a powerful, clear picture. It's God's ultimate plan to repair the broken relationship, and that happens through the resurrection of Jesus.
And what about the 2 days part? Does the study tie that to something specific too?
Yes, it does. The source notes that the number 2 in the Bible is often linked with witnessing or establishing truth. Like you need 2 witnesses to confirm something legally.
Right. I remember that.
So the study links this back to that intense call in verse 3. Let us strive to know Adonai. It argues that this repetition, the striving, it's presented alongside the 2 days, 3 days sequence to really reinforce a central truth.
Oh, jeez.
That humanity, strive as we might, we just cannot fix the relationship with God on our own steam. The 2 witnesses here, in a sense, are the brokenness described back in verse 1 and the striving described here in verse 3. Both point to needing something else, something external, something divine.
So the study is suggesting that the sequence in verse 2 isn't just some general promise of revival, but it points specifically to Jesus' death and resurrection as the witnessed event, the necessary divine act, the thing that makes the healing and the raising up possible.
Precisely. The source presents it as the only way, the sole means, by which the restoration called for in verse 1 can actually happen. Human effort just isn't enough. The solution is tied completely to God's action through Jesus.
Okay.
And that promise of God's coming, mentioned in verse 3, as certain as morning, like the spring rains, that's then seen through this lens of absolute certainty, tied to the certainty of Jesus' resurrection making the way back.
That's a really comprehensive interpretation of those verses.
Yeah.
But despite this clear path the study sees laid out in verses 1 to 3, the source points out that Israel's response, well, it wasn't quite there. God issues a critique in verse 4.
And it's a sharp one, yeah. God speaks directly to Israel, split into its parts, Ephraim and Yehuda, and asks Ephraim, "What should I do to you, Yehud? What should I do to you? For your faithful love is like a morning cloud, like dew that disappears quickly."
That comparison, morning dew. It sounds lovely at first, but it implies something really temporary, doesn't it?
Exactly. That's the point this study makes. Dew is beautiful early on. It sparkles, looks refreshing, substantial maybe. But the minute the sun really hits it, poof, it's gone. It lacks depth, endurance.
Mm-hmm.
The study uses this as a really powerful parallel for Israel's devotion. It was there sometimes, maybe in moments of crisis or during religious festivals, but it wasn't a consistent, abiding thing. It was superficial, fleeting.
And the source is quick to say, look, this isn't just an ancient problem. It suggests this kind of morning dew faith is something we can easily fall into today. Getting caught up in the busyness of life, letting our consistent daily connection with God just evaporate.
Which leads right into God's explanation for why this fleeting devotion is such a problem for him. That's laid out in verses 5 and 6. He says, "This is why I have cut them to pieces by the prophets, slaughtered them with the words from my mouth. The judgment on you shines out like light."
Wow, strong words. Slaughtered them with the words from my mouth.
Yeah. And then verse 6. "For what I desire is mercy, not sacrifices, knowledge of God more than burnt offerings."
This feels like a really pivotal point in the study's interpretation. God wasn't just looking for outward stuff, for religious rituals.
Not at all. The study really emphasizes the contrast God draws right here. He sent prophets basically speaking judgment through his words because the people just weren't getting what he truly wanted. He explicitly states it. Mercy, not sacrifices. Knowledge of God more than burnt offerings.
Right.
Sure, the sacrifices and offerings were part of the commanded worship, but God wanted the internal reality, the heart driving it. He wanted mercy, which implies right relationships, right actions towards others, rooted in him, and a genuine, intimate knowledge of him, not just knowing about him.
So the study sees this as a timeless principle then, that focusing only on the external religious acts without that internal change in the pursuit of really knowing God just misses the whole point.
Precisely. The source draws a clear line from this to modern faith. It suggests that, many today might fulfill religious obligations, go to services, participate in ceremonies, but maybe without that deep hunger for a daily walk or for a genuine, transforming knowledge of God himself. It's that difference between, say, religiosity and a living relationship.
And verse 7 seems to get to the root cause of this superficiality. But they, just like men, have broken the covenant. They have been faithless in dealing with me.
Yeah, the study connects this right back to the covenant God established with Israel, like the one in Leviticus 26, which demanded obedience. And a huge part of that covenant was avoiding idolatry. By Hosea's time, this relationship, this covenant agreement was shattered. Idolatry was everywhere.
And the source material really zooms in on how this broken covenant showed up, particularly highlighting the role of the religious leaders of the priests in verses 8 and 9. This part is pretty intense.
It's incredibly strong language, yeah. Gilead is a city of criminals covered with bloody footprints. Just as bands of robbers wait to ambush someone, so does a gang of Kohanim priests. They commit murder on the road to Shechem. Their conduct is an outrage. Comparing the priests themselves, the ones supposed to lead worship, to murderers and robbers. That's strong.
It really is. How does the study interpret that comparison? Why murderers? What does that mean?
This study interprets it metaphorically. It argues God compared the priests to murderers because they were actively leading the people away from him, leading them into idolatry, which the study frames as spiritual death.
Oh, okay.
The priests were supposed to guide people to worship God properly, often directing them towards Jerusalem. But instead, the source suggests they were directing them or, allowing them to worship God in unauthorized ways, maybe in unauthorized places, using pagan-influenced practices. God saw this as total disobedience, spiritual betrayal. So leading someone into that kind of idolatry, in this view, was like spiritual murder, cutting them off from the true life found only in God.
So the criticism isn't just aimed at the people's sin generally, but specifically at the leadership's failure.
Yeah.
And their active misguidance.
Absolutely. The source really emphasizes this point. It suggests that, sound teaching and leadership are just as crucial today. It draws parallels to the responsibilities Paul lays out, for instance, regarding church leadership, misguiding people in their understanding of who God is. That's presented as a really serious issue, according to this interpretation.
Which then leads right into verse 10, where the core sin, the horrible thing God sees, is named explicitly.
Yes, verse 10. In the house of Israel I have seen a horrible thing. Whoring is found there in Ephraim. Israel is defiled. The study explains this whoring or spiritual prostitution. It wasn't necessarily literal physical acts. It was about their relationship with God.
How so?
By choosing how and where they would worship God, often mixing in practices from the pagan cultures around them, they were essentially trying to make God into something they felt comfortable with. They were crafting a God of their own design.
So the study defines this kind of idolatry not just as, bowing to statues, but as trying to reshape or redefine God himself to fit human preferences or ways of thinking.
Precisely. It's taking the one true God and trying to mold him into an image that aligns better with our desires or our cultural norms, rather than submitting to who he has actually revealed himself to be in his word.
And the study gives a really pointed modern example of this, doesn't it? Suggesting it happens today when people might preach a version of God who's only love, who would never condemn anyone, implying sort of that everyone goes to heaven regardless of belief or action.
Yes, that specific example is used by the source. It's presented as a contemporary illustration of this Hosea 6 principle of whoring. It's taking one attribute of God, his love, but separating it entirely from his justice, his holiness, his other attributes. And in doing so, creating a redefined, more palatable God who fits human desires for universal affirmation, rather than accepting the fuller, often more challenging picture God actually presents of himself.
Wow. That's a powerful insight to pull from this text. The idea that idolatry fundamentally can be about shaping God to our image instead of us being conformed to his.
It definitely shifts the understanding of idolatry. It moves beyond just physical idols to something much more subtle and potentially really pervasive in modern thinking.
Mm-hmm.
What's remarkable, then, is how the chapter finishes. Despite all this brokenness, the fleeting faith, the corrupt leadership, the spiritual prostitution, that final verse circles right back to the certainty of God's plan and his future action.
Verse 11, For you too, Yehuda, a harvest will come, when I restore the fortunes of my people.
Right. The study interprets this harvest not necessarily as, say, immediate political restoration for Judah back then, but looking forward to a future appointed day of judgment for all humanity. It's presented as a certain event, and on that day, everyone faces accountability, and for God's people, it will ultimately be a day of receiving rewards and a final complete restoration of fortunes. The source connects this idea to the bigger biblical narrative of future judgment and reward, even referencing texts like Revelation 22.twexum about Jesus bringing his reward with him.
So the chapter, according to this study's interpretation, moves from that initial call to return and the promise of healing through the really painful reality of human failure and warped understanding of God to end not on despair, but on the absolute certainty of God's ultimate plan. For judgment, yes, but also restoration for his people.
Exactly. It kind of bookends the themes. The healing promise way back in verse 1 finds its ultimate fulfillment in the future restoration of fortunes in verse 11. But crucially, only through the means pointed to prophetically in verses 2 and 3. It stands in sharp contrast to the flawed attempts at relationship described in verses 4 through 10.
It provides a really clear, albeit challenging narrative arc for this chapter when seen through the lens of this particular study. It lays out such a stark contrast between that superficial, self-defined faith and the depth of genuine knowledge of God and trust in his appointed way of restoration.
And it constantly brings it back to that core tension, doesn't it? Human inability, human distortion, versus God's certain promise and his action. The restoration isn't something we achieve by our own striving or by making God into who we wish he was. According to this study, it comes by returning to him and knowing him as he is through the way he has provided.
And that ties directly back to the study's heavy emphasis on verses 2 and 3, seeing Jesus' death and resurrection as that provided way.
Exactly. That's the core message of hope that the study finds embedded within the critique and the call to return. The healing is certain, but it comes from him, and it comes through his means.
So wrapping up this deep dive into Hosea chapter 6, looking through the particular lens of this source material from the Olive Grove podcast site, what are the key takeaways we should probably carry forward?
Well, this study really highlights several foundational messages, I think. First, that invitation to return to God is always there. It acknowledges our brokenness, yes, but it anchors our hope firmly in his certain promise to heal and restore.
And this source places huge significance on verses 6, 2, and 3, doesn't it? Interpreting them prophetically, pointing directly to Jesus' death and resurrection as the means for that healing and reconciliation. And it supports that with the symbolic meaning it sees in the numbers 2 and 3.
Right. Then there's that really sharp critique of superficial faith, that faithful love. That's like the morning dew just gone too quickly. This is contrasted so strongly with what God truly desires: mercy, active compassion, and a genuine deep knowledge of him. Valued way more than just empty rituals or sacrifices.
The study also dug into the historical context, didn't it? Israel's broken covenant through idolatry, and it pointedly criticized the priests for misleading the people, drawing that parallel to the dangers of misguidance today.
And it offered that really thought-provoking definition of idolatry as spiritual prostitution. Not just physical idols, but the attempt to redefine God to fit our own desires or comfort zones. Using that modern example of shaping God solely into a figure of love who never condemns.
Right, that was striking. Finally, though, despite that unflinching look at human failure, the study reminds us of the certain promise back in verse 6:11. A future judgment day is coming, a harvest where fortunes are restored and rewards are given to God's people.
Yeah, it definitely reinforces the value of really digging into Scripture, doesn't it? Seeing how a focused study like this one can reveal layers of meaning and connection that maybe aren't obvious just from a quick read.
And it brings the ancient text message right into our present lives. For you listening, maybe this deep dive prompts some reflection on the nature of your own faith. Is it deep and enduring? Is it a daily pursuit of knowing God? Or maybe sometimes does it feel a bit more like that morning dew, beautiful for a moment, but easily evaporated by the heat of everyday life?
And what does knowing God truly mean in your life, based on the principles this study highlights? Are you really seeking to understand and submit to his nature as he's revealed himself in Scripture? Or perhaps are there ways you might, maybe unintentionally, be shaping him to fit your own desires or cultural expectations?
Yeah, these lessons from Hosea chapter 6, viewed through this specific lens, they definitely challenge us, I think, to consider what genuine faith and a true relationship with God look like, beyond just the outward religious activity. It's a powerful message of return, yes, but also restoration and the truth about really knowing God.
It's certainly a lot to consider from just one chapter.
Absolutely. Well, thank you for joining us for this deep dive today.